happy to bring this to you. A general agenda with my portion will cover the changes. We'll talk about some new NCHRP research projects that are on the horizon that will lead to additional updates in the future to the Highway Capacity Manual, and a little bit about where we're going from here and how you can get involved should you choose to accept that. A little bit of history. I know we're all technical, but I love historical aspects and all of that. I'll try not to spend 10 minutes just on this slide alone, but a little bit of history on this timeline here, all the way back to the first edition of the HCM in 1950. Third edition, that one's near and dear to my heart because that's the one that was still in operation when I was an undergrad, believe it or not. I know I don't look that old, but that's true. Also, as far as I know, that's the first software commercially available implementation by way of McTrans. And then some updates in the 90s leading up to the fourth edition. Most of these were not called by their edition name. Most of them were called by the year, the 65, 85, 94, 97, 2000, etc. But then we started switching to editions, and we're on to the seventh edition in 2022. Just on a note on the timeline, the 2010 was the big implementation of multimodal level of service or quality of service metrics. And then with the seventh edition, you'll see today a number of new updates, including new chapter on network analysis. Little background on all of these updated HCMs have a large number of research projects that feed the development of the technical material, as you'll see in our slides today. One's based on pedestrians, also of course, the CAV, FHWA pooled fund study, heavily led by Oregon DOT, and you'll see Peter's presentation that also addresses that after mine. There's some updates to the two-lane method, as well as the new network analysis chapter 38. And then, of course, various updates throughout. So just some updates on pedestrians. We always, as a committee, like to use a time like this to remind people that the Highway Capacity Manual has a lot of non-highway modes included in it, including bicycles and pedestrians. So there's been many ways to analyze and develop metrics for non-motorized modes, and it continues to get better over time. So urban streets, signalized intersections, two-way stops and mid-block crossings, and off-street paths, for instance, are existing methods for doing pedestrian analyses. And then the next series of slides will kind of have the old quote unquote or the sixth edition on the left, with on the right the new HCM seventh edition modifications. And so for uncontrolled crossings, two-way stops, and mid-block, there's been some modifications in terms of level of service being based more on a percentage of dissatisfied or satisfied pedestrians, and being more sensitive to a variety of parameters, including an updated set of motorist yielding rate tables that are very informative and interesting to look at. So with different pedestrian treatments, what type of motorist yielding rate you could expect based on that, and that's a very useful table, for instance, out of that methodology to be able to draw upon as you're looking at project implementations and alternatives. Delay is still calculated and sensitive to design pedestrian, and I'm going to minimize this so you guys don't see that the time. Sorry. If we look at signalized intersections, we've been able to do a variety of metrics for pedestrians over time, including delays and other density-based calculations, circulation areas, and so forth. But that's been expanded with the HCM 7th. So there's definitely more there, including talking about the all ped bar and stance or ped scramble, and then a variety of other crossing alternatives that you'll see there. And the flow of the way the steps are listed out now breaks apart the delay based versus the corner and crosswalk circulation based, because it was kind of misleading before, made it seem like you had to do the corner and crosswalk circulation areas in order to get to the further steps that included the delay or the multimodal quality of service calculations, which really is what the level of service grade is based on. But now those are broken apart separately and are much more clear in terms of how you might want to analyze pedestrians at signalized intersections. When it comes to PEDs at along urban street corridors, the revised method is more sensitive to diversion. So previously it didn't quite account as sensitively to the fact that people really don't like to have to walk half a block to a signal and then cross and then walk back, and hence why we see people crossing mid-block even when there's not a striped crosswalk to do so. So there's some increased sensitivity to that, and so the method is improved in that matter as well. So just keep that in mind. New methods for PEDs, always been there for quite a while, as well as bike methods. So a lot in the highway capacity manual, not related to the word highways in quotes. In terms of connected and autonomous vehicles, I know Brian at ODOT, who's also a committee member and subcommittee chair, Brian Dunn, and others, of course, were in these places from the public agency perspective of all this talk about CAVs and having these long range planning projects where they would need to start making some type of accounting for how might CAVs change the actual operations from a planning perspective, at least. And so here's just some screenshots of typical types of tip and long-term planning studies that are routinely done by various government agencies, and how can how can the HCM help agencies account for the impending levels of CAVs that may be realized in terms of the transportation planning process. So I'm not going to talk this slide very much at all. We've all seen a bazillion CAVs ad nauseum presentations over the last 5 years. But we are talking about CAVs that have vehicle-to-vehicle communication abilities and cooperative adaptive cruise control. That's kind of the basis of what the assumptions were in the underlying research. This led to CAVs being methodologies and procedures being introduced into Chapter 26, which is the freeway facility supplemental chapter, and then chapters 31 and 33 for signals and roundabouts. For the HCM, if you haven't looked in a while, there's these supplemental chapters that are available in electronic form online. It's where a lot of the details go. There were page limitations for the actual publication of the HCM that got imposed a while back. And so answer to that is a very robust appendix, if you will, of all these supplemental detail chapters. And that's where the CAV methodologies made their way into the 7th edition. All right, the other thing I will say here is basically what you'll see in the next number of slides have to do with how CAV capacity adjustment factors or service volume tables were created as part of the HCM 7 to help in those planning applications that we described a little bit ago. One other interesting note is, traditionally in highway capacity manual, it's gather data, do research, develop methods based on observations and so forth. But of course, with needing to be able to plan for various levels of penetration rates for CAVs, there's no data to go out there and gather necessarily. So it's the first, I believe it's the first, I think you can almost quote me on that, where methods being brought into the HCM were developed not from data gathering, right, but purely from simulation environments. And so there was some major research done on using microsimulation in order to evaluate CAV penetrations in different conditions. And from there, scale it back, right, into a more deterministic planning level approach to then make that available to the masses by way of the highway capacity manual. So that's the idea and basically the way in which it was approached, and what it really leads to is the ability CAV factors for all, if you will, without having to dive into the simulation environment. All right, so with that, if we look at freeways here, basically when we look at what the main user inputs would be, it's really about market penetration. So 0 to 100% and going through and using that as an input. If I have a certain proportion of CAVs in my traffic stream, how will that affect my capacity values, essentially? And so that's what you see in the tables and the graph on the right. As always with HCM, we have a lot of little bullets of like, this didn't consider this, that, or the other thing, or is not applicable in certain circumstances. It's all the fine print. So you can read that in the lower left in terms of oversaturated conditions or managed lanes and truck platooning and so forth. But really it allows for a nice summary of the projected effects of various CAV market penetrations on capacity. And so we'll see that for freeways as we do in this slide. And then also in terms of service volume tables. So these are kind of your ability to basically get a sketch planning, if you will, quick and dirty lookup. There's a number of assumptions in all these tables that are listed, but it's a way to look up and say, hey, if I have a two-way volume of vehicles per day per lane, and I have a certain percentage of CAVs in my traffic stream in a certain area type with a certain type of terrain, then I can look up what my service volume would be, meaning I can go up to that volume and still have level of service E. So basically that's the general lookup table that was developed that complements what we saw a moment ago on actual adjustments to capacity. So we'll follow that similar structure when we go over into interrupted flow. So that's what we look at in terms of signalized intersections. So on the right side, you'll see a graph of market penetration versus base saturation flow. You guys may recall from traffic engineering, whatever, 101, quote unquote, all of the variety of adjustment factors to saturation flow that's part of the process, but it all starts with that S sub naught, which is 1,900 passenger cars per hour per lane, and that's our first line on the table, assuming 0% CAVs. And from there, as those CAV penetration rates increase, then so does the base saturation flow rate, and then you continue to scale that with a variety of other factors. So there's some nuances there and some details. I believe, if I remember right, the factor for lane width doesn't get applied anymore because of the fact that, as humans, we're sensitive to lane width, but as it becomes more connected and automated, that goes away. We also have some other tables with adjustment factors specifically for protected left turns or permitted left turns. Now all of these are interpretable. So if you have a 25% market penetration you want to analyze, then you just go in and do a good old fashioned old school interpolation of that table, and then you can run with the number that you come up with from there. So that's for signalized intersections. As far as the adjustments to the SAT flow rate, we have a similar service volume table. So again, with a whole host of assumptions, but with various G over C ratios and number of through lanes, and then different proportions of the CAVs, then you can look up what your various levels of volume can be to still have level service E from these service volume tables. And then we move over to roundabouts. That's the other kind of the third area in which these CAV adjustment factors played out. And really it worked its way again as an input as market penetration percentage, and then it worked its way into a set of adjustment factors. So just as a refresher course, and in the 7th edition, it's spelled out really nicely. If we look at a generalized formula for roundabout capacity, we see this equation here, and we see there's an A intercept parameter and a B slope parameter, and some other things in there as far as conflicting flow rates and so forth. With the addition, this is the base case with 0 CAVs, just what those A and B values are. And in generally, if there's an increase in the A value or a decrease in the B value, that increases the entry lane capacity. And so what happens with the inclusion of the CAV research is that now there's the ability to calculate an adjusted capacity that includes some factors for each of those. So factors for the A intercept and also for the B slope. And from there is where you get this table that we just saw a few moments ago, but at least it provides a little bit more context. So if you have your proportion of traffic that's CAV, for instance, 20%, then depending on if you have a single lane entry with one circulating lane or two circulating lanes, or a dual lane entry to the roundabout with one or two circulating lanes, then you can look up your respective adjustment factor to account for the effect of the CAV. And what we see on these charts on the left side would be at 0%, and on the right side is at 100%. So two ends of the spectrum, but you can see how the increase in market penetration of the CAVs increases, of course, the capacity values for all of those various conditions. So it's a nice plot to see the effects of that. All right, a lot of stuff to cover in a small amount of time, so I'm going a little bit fast, so bear with me. I'm also, even after 30 years of doing this, get dry mouth. There we go. Not quite Miller time yet, so La Croix. Okay. I said I wasn't doing any product placements, Randy. Stop me. All right, any rate, chapter 15, updates to the 2-lane highway section. Again, we're going to look through HCM 6th edition and HCM 7th edition, and we're just going to do this quickly with some key bullet points. With the 7th edition, it included now segment types to include for passing constrained conditions or passing zones or passing lanes. That's new, as well as directly inputting percentage of heavy vehicles, and entering your flow rates for this method, at least in a vehicle per hour. And then in terms of accounting for vertical and horizontal alignments, there are now 5 classifications for both, and they can be based for the vertical case based on segment length and slope percentage for both upgrade and downgrade. And then for horizontal, of course, it's more based on the curve radius and the super elevation percentages. So those are modified or new components that are now built into the 2-lane methodology. We have some nice graphs here on the bottom where we see flow rate charted against, on the left, average speed, in the middle, percent followers, and on the right, the follower density. I'm reading those off because the font will not allow you to read that, I'm sure. But basically for performance measures now, it's average speed with this curvilinear relationship. It's removed the percent time spent following parameter that had been in there previously. And we now have a percent followers and a follower density instead for the 2-lane highway method. So some modifications on that, and then also on the way things are classified and what the service measure is. So the service measure being follower density or followers per mile, rather than average travel speed and time spent following. And that leads to these modified tables that you see below. On the right side is the new HCM 7th edition. All right, and I think there's just 1 or 2 more slides on the 2-lane highway in terms of the capacity value being 700 vehicles per hour rather than passenger cars per hour, and having these lower values for merging friction and included as part of the passing lane segment. Base free flow speed can still be estimated based on the posted speed limit, and there is there's an additional facility scope where you can have a length weighted aggregation of segment follower density values to be able to analyze a full facility in this 2-lane highway method. All right, a couple slides on an arterial method, active traffic and demand management. So a while ago in the HCM brought in some reliability analysis chapters. And here now from an arterial perspective, being able to focus on dynamic lane assignments, reversible lanes, dynamic turn restrictions, basically using that travel time reliability as the basis for the analysis, and being able to then include the effects of things like non-recurring sources of congestion. So there's a slide to kind of show what that might look like for adding a reversible center lane. So in the 6th edition with a single analysis versus now in the 7th edition with this ATDM analysis, being able to look at multiple days and look at different things like traffic demand fluctuation and weather conditions and how about incidents, and seeing how those measures of effectiveness can change and what you can get out of those from a before and after study perspective with these travel time indices from this method. So that's something you might find interesting and look into implementing if you didn't know that was there in the HCM. And then last but not least, there's big research on this new network method, which basically culminated in a new chapter in HCM 7, which is chapter 38 on network analysis, with some key points here to be able to evaluate spillback between arterials and freeways, travel time across facilities, and to be able to conduct lane by lane for freeways. I know I'm getting close to my end of my time, and really the bulk of the presentation is almost done. Really what I want to highlight here is in the 6th edition and before, it was really facility by facility analysis, so urban street, freeway, urban street again. With this new method, it integrates those analyses, and really I recommend you just find out, looking through this and digging into the chapter 38 as well, but really, and the underlying NCHRP study that was presented earlier. But it does help to look at the next couple slides to get a summary. Really, this brings in a lot on Q spillback and looking at those points where there could be insufficient capacity because of those items listed, ramp metering or freeway merge points or insufficient storage length. And again, more from this deterministic perspective, different ways the freeways are impacted based on spillback onto the freeway, or the different Q influence areas being modeled as part of this process. Okay, so user inputs, queue storage at the off ramp, and what type of spillback regime is it single lane off ramp, dual lane off ramp, what happens at the terminal, How is that controlled and so forth. And then from there, some analytical methods, and there's some software implementations of these, of course, as well, in order to look at the lane by lane performance, and ultimately to look at the left versus the right. Again, segmented approach in the 6th edition, and then the new integrated approach in the 7th edition. In this case, looking at an OD from one arterial using the freeway, and then another arterial to the north. Also, it accounts for this multiple period analysis, so travel times of greater than 15 minutes. You can see the 6th edition more linear, just going straight down that single analysis period. And in the new 7th edition, once you hit past the first analysis period, then shifting over into analysis period 2, and how that can give you a more refined analysis of the network. All right, I know that I'm running low on time. I'm going to just say, hey, we got some really cool additional research coming, like arterial weaving, for instance, as well as some other additional updates for merge divergent weaving and so forth that you see on your screen. Those will all be working their way into future editions. I will say the 7th edition is available right now on TRB's website in digital form. I believe it is not yet out in physical form. I have not seen that, but keep your eyes open for that. The digital format is an EPUB version, so you can have it on native, right, on a tablet. It's not just a PDF. And then lastly, I got to say, please, if you're interested in at all, go to our HCQS website listed there. And these are various subcommittees that we have as part of the committee. If you're not already and want to become a friend of our committee, and you please go to your MyTRB profile or create one if you don't have one yet. And then where I put the little red arrow, there's a link to become a friend of our committee. And we're ACP 40. My joke is armchair philosophers. That's who we are. We sit there and philosophize about traffic operations. And again, thank you. If you have any questions, you can email me after or at the end of the presentation. 3 minutes over, but not bad.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill.
All right.
So in the sake of time here, we'll just keep moving it right along. If you have comments, drop them in the chat. Hopefully we'll still have some time here at the end. But for now, we'll go ahead and kick it over to Peter Skedema over at ODOT, and we'll get into some of the details of his presentation. Peter?
Thank you, Randy. Sorry, I just had a Charlie horse that's in here. I think, ow. Get my screen shared here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. And my name is Peter Skedema. I'm with the Oregon Department of Transportation Planning Analysis Unit. I'm our transportation analysis engineer and been around for about 30 years or so with ODOT, and of which the last, all but the last 5 or about 5 with TPAL. This particular presentation will be on the analysis procedures manual, mostly on the highway capacity manual version 7, connected and automated vehicles, and some other APM updates that we got going on. So, mentioned just going to go over mostly on our CAV integration of the CAVs into the APM. Talk briefly on the quote HCM adoption for the APM, and then our other APM updates. For the integration of the APM, as Bill mentioned, the CAV was generally mostly led by ODOT. ODOT was the lead state in the TRB pooled fund study. This ended up with as a set of capacity analysis factors based on market penetration rates for freeways, roundabouts, and signals. You saw with Bill's presentation. This has now been obviously part of the HCM itself. We actually retained Kittleson and Associates, who was the lead research firm in the pooled fund study, combined with the remaining contract time that's still active. And so as part of some research implementation, we can actually use some of this to actually integrate the CAV work into the APM relatively directly and faster than if we could do it on our own. Generally, this is going to be generally two phases through spring of 2023. First, there'll be integration of the HCM capacity analysis factors into the APM. And secondly, assuming this is a more of a contingent work, is an investigation of the CAV impacts on demand and some related scenario guidance with that. And as Bill, mentioned in his presentation, this research and pooled fund study is generally based on these vehicles being connected and automated, so the vehicles can connect with each other and with the roadside infrastructure. There's allowance in there for cooperative movements, so they can do things like platooning. These are consistent with the Society of Automotive, Engineers level 4 and 5. So this mainly means these are vehicles are completely self-driving without human intervention in certain circumstances or all circumstances. So this means things like CAV only lanes or CAV only facility, for instance. Keep in mind that those level 5s don't require a driver, as in today's parlance. So you could you throw a whole bunch of 6-year-olds into the vehicle again for a birthday party. You don't need a licensed driver with the level 5s. And with today, most new cars, almost all new cars nowadays are sold with some manner of connected technology. So with the cell phones and hotspots. A lot of these base automated vehicle features are now available: adaptive cruise control, lane keeping, or some limited self-driving. So you can buy anything from L0 all the way up to level 3 vehicles today. However, one of the only things that's really certain about CAVs is that it's relatively uncertain. There are large amounts of many outstanding issues, such as what to do with the vehicle codes, ownership, insurance, roadway design, to name only a few. There really are no level 4, level 5 vehicles existing commercially for personal use. You can't go out to your neighborhood car dealer and go buy one. And this is kind of Bill mentioned before, everything the pooled fund study had to be based on simulation, agent-based simulation, and using variable different levels of these CAVs within assuming a mixed traffic stream. So again, there's no real life information that can be directly pulled on this today. There's a lot of uncertainty related to potential societal changes. What are these going to do to actual demand, actual modes, actual trips? There's a lot of some unknowns there. And then, of course, the predicted adoption rates. These market penetrations are really highly, highly variable. As an example, here's a document. Here's a figure I just pulled out of the pooled fund study. And this illustrates some different adoption rates. You can see from high to different levels of disruption. So example, you could say, well, maybe that high disruption is maybe that's the result of some, say, mandatory regulations or requirements. Maybe it's mixed in or commingled with the EV EV adoptions or GHG reductions, or so, as example. That might cause that high spike. The low, for instance, could be saying, we're not going to do anything. We'll let the market do whatever it wants, and people just adopt these over time. That could be relatively, kind of a status quo kind of a thing, or a medium kind of disruption. That maybe that's a combination of these two, maybe with some like incentives. But you can see that in 20 years from now, you could have a substantial portion of the vehicles being connected automated vehicle, or you could have relatively very little. But it's really going to be dependent. We really don't know where we're going to be. So with that, it's really that we're really going to need to be using a range of realistic market penetration rates. It's really not necessarily because of all this uncertainty with these MPRs and all the other issues that kind of mention and more. It's really going to be incorrect to rely on a single capacity value, saying this is the capacity, here's my number. If we're really going to have to end up using a range of scenarios, was going to result in a bookend range of varying capacities. And while the HCM does show the MPR levels, as you saw from Bill's presentation with the different tables, it really doesn't necessarily give guidance on what to use when. So the APM portion, the really important piece of the APM work, was have guidance on how and when to choose these market penetration rates and developing these particular test scenarios. This update will hit multiple APM chapters. So for this first phase, a lot of the bulk of the work will show up in a new appendix for chapter 6. In the future year forecasting, this will have the definitions, assumptions, are generally the basic market penetration rate and scenario guidance will be there. Chapters 11 through 13. These will be where these capacity analysis factors sit and their related guidance. So, and for those specific facility and analysis types. Then we also will have some mentioned there for CAVs in chapter 15 with the traffic simulation. So some high level guidance on how to better simulate for CAVs for VZIM and SIM traffic. Phase 1 also includes development of 5 case study examples, which will be kind of integrated throughout these chapters. And then there are also going to be training developed as part of this phase, and we'll present this at future APM user group meetings. Phase 2. Phase 2 is the contingent chapter. So again, we're looking at there probably some changes to chapter 7, which is our system planning. Here we'll have some guidance for CAV scenarios and transportation planning, and these higher level analysis models that we have. And then chapter 17, we'll be kind of talking about more of guidance on modeling the CAVs and demand effects into the travel demand models. Phase 2 also includes some written final reports and things, and also documentation as well. So where are we with this? We're starting it right now. This is kind of working its way through the ODOT contracting process. Hopefully, we'll kick off this spring, and hopefully the next couple months. Right now, it's really going to be between TPOS staff and some region staff. However, we would like to have a mix of reviewers of people that are interested on this. So this is an opportunity to be involved on the technical advisory committee that'll be set up for this. And this generally with here, there's going to be these we'll be looking at the chapter updates in bundles, and each bundle will have a meeting that goes along with that. There's also development of these case study reviews in there with related meetings, development of at least a couple sets of different training materials. And then if we do the phase 2 work, with at least up to potentially 4 different white papers and documents, and with the related meetings. So this is something that could be 40, 50, 60 hours or so, depending on for meeting times and review time. So if you're interested in CAVs, like to be a part of it, please send me an email. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. We can't have everyone who's interested. We get a lot of folks, but I do want to be able to get a broad swath of reviewers involvement. So I'm just going to talk a little bit here on the HCM 7 adoption. We don't generally ODOT. We don't necessarily have any formal process for the HCM. So it's more of it being available there. And so it's really going to be dependent on the scope of work language and contracts that being written in there. As you know, it's not really a good idea to change methodologies right in the middle of a project. So I wouldn't do this right in the middle of any active projects, but future projects coming up. So it's important to change that boilerplate scope language, contract language into HCM 7 instead of HCM 6. Have it, documented in the method, your methodology memorandums, and say we're going to be doing the HCM 7 processes instead for that. And then get the local ODOT planners and project leaders to sign off on that. And then also, of course, available tools. That's one of the things right now. We have HCS 2022 is out now, out replacing HCS 7. You know, Synchro, Sidra, those updates are still yet to be released or announced. You know, and there's potentially for like the CAVs with the capacity analysis factors. You know, those factors were existing in HCM 6. So there are some ability. For instance, you could take the HCM 7 text and then modify some of the CAFs in places in some of these present software tools. So, for instance, you could do adjust the saturation flow rates in Synchro, for instance, to do signals. You can't adjust the roundabout coefficients, for instance. Couldn't really use it for roundabouts, but you could use it for signals. You know, Vistro, Sidra, they have the capabilities. You could modify the CAFs, for instance, to allow HCM type techniques for, you know, those for signals and roundabouts there, as well as, for example. So, but some of this is going to be a kind of a waiting game as the tools need to catch up over the next, you know, few months. And some other APM updates in progress. We're going to be working on updating our Chapter 1. The ODOT information section we've had over the number of last couple of months, a number of mini reorganizations and unit consolidations and groups and some things shifting around. So we're going to need to update. We're updating that to match our current structure. Chapter 2, there are the scoping. The tool sets in there are being updated to getting rid of some of the obsolete ones and adding some of the new methodologies. And then Chapter 3, a lot of this is going to be updating to the new count system guidance. This is from getting away from the old traffic count management program into a new from MS2 cloud-based software. This is going to be we're updating all of the appendices, everything relating to here's the how do you use the proper reporting and reporting functions, getting outputs for counts and like that. So that all that will be redone. And then Chapter 6 in the future volumes, we're updating our latent demand section to include induced demand, and I'll have a couple slides on that after this next slide that I do want to hit on. And then for other APM updates in progress is going to augmenting the DTA section and the mesoscopic section in Chapter 8, because the DTA is becoming a bit more prevalent now, the need for it, especially in the Portland metro area. So hopefully add some more exhibits and examples to that, make it a bit more user-friendly there. And then for Chapter 15, we're trying to get time to restart the work on updating and integrating the Visum protocol into Chapter 15. So this will be integrated as a separate document, integrated within the chapter, and apply to all simulation tools as examples. So the calibration requirements would apply to SimTraffic, for instance, because SimTraffic, the new version of SimTraffic, just need as much calibration as Visum does. And then we're also working on rebuilding the guidance for the environmental traffic data. So rebuilding it for noise, streamlining that procedure, creating air quality traffic data guidance, and as well as adding in a GHG guidance as well. And then lastly, working on Chapter 19, the documentation chapter. This was the chapter that was still in version 1 language. Here we're kind of updating it for general current practice. A lot of it's going to be bringing in some stuff from Chapter 2, which will be a lot of the methodology memorandums and things like that we brought into Chapter 19 as it's a bit better place. And then also, some of the stuff here of future updates is going to be obviously some stuff that Bill raised in his presentation, Chapter 11, 2-lane highways. We'll have to relook at that, things like the arterial ATDM. There's multimodal. There's going to be things there to update. We have things, the new transportation planning rule implementation will likely cause changes to things like for performance measures, methodology, inventory. So we'll, as we figure that out, we'll have to update the APM as well. couple of the things I do wanted to hit back on the latent versus induced demand is the new section of augmentation into the APM. This is kind of a summary slide from a previous presentation. It's important to note with latent induced demand that definitions are important. There's a lot of confusion between which one is the other, and they might say one word and mean the other, and actually accidentally flip the definitions around. It just is important is to keep a note that latent demand is really a short-term response. So this is usually something that would occur in weeks or in a month kind of a thing. It's usually confined to the study area, project area. And typically for it to occur, users really have to prefer a different route if performance is superior to the current route. So if you got faster speed, shorter travel time, people will have to move to the new route. Induced demand versus induced demand, this is a long-term economic response. So this is generally the case. This is months, could be months, years, or even decades in the making here. This is usually impacts. This will be spread throughout the study area, potentially more likely beyond the study area and outside the study area. And this is again that reaction to people and businesses reacting to the conditions and performance. The induced demand is really resulting from changes in land use and economic conditions. So it's not just a network response that you might see in the latent demand. There's a couple notes. The APM language to this is mode agnostic. So keep in mind that latent induced demand is not just a roadway thing. It is you can have latent demand for say for a new bike facility or based on new transit frequency, or you can, for instance, get induced development and boost demand impacts, say from a light rail line as an example. So it's not just going to be a roadway. The other note with this is that Oregon, because of Oregon's land use laws, we really face a low risk to a low risk for induced demand. And because all the changes in land usually need to be approved by local jurisdictions. So a facility by itself, you build it, it's not going to instantly cause induced demand to occur. But you have to have those have to be those changes to the network and to the land use. Now, of course, it can increase pressure on the potential to change that, but by itself, it's not necessarily instantly going to cause a demand change. And then lastly, this is important here, and these are these induced demand calculators. This is something here that's gotten a lot more press as of late, as State of California has now adopted a VMT standard now to replacing LOS for their mobility, and I believe therefore also for their development review. And the important things with this is because I kind of mentioned because of our Oregon's land use laws, while these things are relatively simple, these calculators are inaccurate for use in Oregon. And these are generally been based on, you may have seen it from the UC California Davis method. However, there's a number of variations of calculators out there. There's one here, example here, the shift calculator has been adapted for, it has all counties and all MPO areas for all 50 states in here. This example, if I just added a mile of an extra lane to a pair of Medford's interchanges that are 3 miles apart. Here's an example here. This is only considers lane miles and vehicles mile traveled with the elasticity constant. You see for Oregon, the constant is 0. So really, it is just direct. It is using just a direct relationship between lane miles and vehicles miles traveled. The issue with these calculators is that it mixes all the demand types together, all the forecasted planned demand, the induced demand, the latent demand. It is all mixed up together and does not differentiate between. It does not consider any impacts to Oregon's land use laws, which are UGBs, things like that, which are unique. Does not consider any impact of local land use or economic context, does not consider any population or demographic changes as an example. and does not consider any, as I mentioned, not consider any latent demand route shifts. So it's not considers any of that. It also considers all the lanes to all be equivalent. So it does not consider, auxiliary lanes of any type. So it assumes that a climbing lane, a passing lane, HOV lane, weaving lane, truck bypass lane are all considered to be exactly equivalent to a general purpose lane. So because of all of these issues and use of these calculators for Oregon is just simply going to end up being a wrong result, is that we would be requesting here is that really that these things should not be used for any induced or latent demand effects on any ODOT funded projects or plans. I'd really would say that really they shouldn't be used in the state at all for any type of effect, because you're not going to have a correct answer. And so here's my contact information, email here. So if anyone wants to put in for review for the CAV TAC, please send me a note. Otherwise, then and I'm finished with this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. Right on time. So we still have a few minutes here for questions. There's a few comments that we have in the chat box with some good information in it, but I'm not really seeing any questions. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. You could also raise your hand and we can do them directly. And again, I would encourage anybody to sign up with Peter for that technical advisory committee on the CAV. I think that's be a lot of good discussion on that here coming up within our local area. And I guess in response to that, Peter, has ODOT done any sensitivity testing with any projects currently in motion, whether it's IBR or any of the tooling, to see how these factors may adjust a range of outcomes for those projects?
I am not aware of any of that. We haven't done anything in T-Power ourselves. I'm not aware of others have at this point.
Okay. Yeah, and as Randy had mentioned and Bill as well, there's a lot of factors and barriers that may influence those market penetration rates, cost being a big one of those, at least in the near term. And so I think we may be looking to more adaptive planning and looking at a range of outcomes rather than a specific outcome as we've typically done in our particular methods. All right, not seeing any questions come through here. Just a couple notes that came through. Brian Dunn had mentioned that the HCM 7 two-lane highway uses follower density for LOS. Bill had mentioned that Vistro currently has the HCM 7 updates already integrated, so you're able to take that software and be off to the races. Just note for ODOT projects and many of the agencies within ODOT, you'll still need to have that method officially adopted as part of the, I guess there's not an official adoption process, but it needs to be fully integrated into the APM before you could apply that. And I had made a comment on latent demand that it's not also just on route choice, but also departure time. You might delay your trip a little bit to avoid the congestion, but you're still making that same trip. So it's not really a new trip. It's just either different route or different departure time in which you make that trip. And so those are all things that certainly influence our operations. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and conclude. Final plug and announcement. I just dropped into the chat window here. It's not up on the web yet, but it will be very shortly. The OMUG, Oregon Models User Group, is hosting a joint event with the ITE SimCap. We'll be doing that May 12th from 10 to noon, and it'll be a dynamic traffic assignment panel. So look for that information. There's a lot of good speakers on a variety of DTA topics. So join us for that. And with that, I'll go ahead and bring the session to a close. So once again, thank you, Bill and Peter, for your presentations.
Welcome. Thank you.